Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. Let each know that for each the body, the mind, and the soul have been free to fulfill themselves. These words are from President Nelson Mandela. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Ubuntu Dialogue. Justice with compassion. Together we embody the spirit of Ubuntu, I am because we are. As we launch this inaugural series, we are called to remember the wisdom of our African ancestors.
As we gather here this evening, we do so in a world that feels increasingly divided. Across continents and communities, we see conflict, displacement, inequality, and fear challenging the very fabric of our shared humanity. And it is precisely in moments like these that the wisdom of Ubuntu calls to us. It tells us that our destinies are intertwined, that our well-being depends on how we see and treat one another. It is a call to rebuild connection and to meet injustice not in isolation, but with solidarity. The Ubuntu Dialogues were created to offer space for reflection, relation, and rejuvenation, and to imagine what collective care can look like in today's world.
In every nation, in every clan, the elders to a person, whether woman or man, shared a common truth, one truth to understand that the spirit of the people is equal to the power of the land.
You know, it speaks about oneness and openness, you know, because when we have Ubuntu in you, you wouldn't do what you wouldn't want it to be done to another person to you. It has no race, it has no color, it has no gender. When we grew up in South Africa, when a traveler is passing, any race, if they are thirsty, they would be invited. We don't even know them, but you see this woman is tired. Even now, we still would do it. I know people are cautious these days, but it's still within us. It's still in our values. It will never change.
And now we turn to the heart of this evening, our Ubuntu Dialogue. We're deeply privileged to welcome our three distinguished leaders to the stage. Dr. Siyabulela Mandela is a South African scholar, human rights activist, and global peace advocate. He holds a PhD in international relations with research focused on conflict resolution and peace building in Africa. A passionate voice for justice and equality, he has worked with organizations around the world to advance human rights and democratic governance. As the great-grandson of Nelson Mandela, he continues his family's legacy of leadership rooted in compassion and social change. Dr. Kofi Hope is a Rhodes Scholar, community leader, and social entrepreneur dedicated to advancing racial and economic justice in Canada. He is the co-founder and CEO of Monumental, a leadership and strategy consultancy that helps organizations build equitable and sustainable futures. A former executive director of the CEE, Center for Young Black Professionals, he has spent his career empowering youth and transforming systems through inclusive innovation. Guiding this important conversation tonight is Ms. Laura Williams, founder and managing partner of Williams HR Law and president and CEO of Williams HR Consulting. She is a respected lawyer, strategist, and thought leader with expertise in workplace law, human rights, and organizational leadership. She has advised leaders across sectors on building inclusive, resilient, and values-driven organizations. And she frequently chairs, educates, and keynotes on equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. Tonight, she is our moderator. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you so much, Fahad, and good evening, everyone. This is really a special occasion. I have to tell you, I've been so excited for this discussion because we've been gathered here tonight not only for an event, it's something more than an event. We're here to take part in a conversation meant to reconnect us to something deeply human, something that reminds us of who we are to one another. At a time when the world feels increasingly divided, when polarization, fear, and fatigue often overshadow compassion, the spirit of Ubuntu offers a way forward. We've heard tonight from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who opened us up with a real, yes, there was a comical way of really getting to the essence, but truly to the essence of what Ubuntu is. And we've also heard from Consul General Thandi Sanduza, who really, again, expanded upon the true essence of Ubuntu being, I am because we are. It's the belief that our humanity is bound together, that our flourishing depends on each other's. With our room tonight intentionally attended by several of the leaders of tomorrow, the first Ubuntu Dialogue invites us to explore what it means to belong, to lead, and to build resilience together in a rapidly changing world. We're truly honored to have with us two extraordinary thought leaders who embody these values in the work that they do and in who they are in their day-to-day lives. Dr. Siyabulela Mandela and Dr. Kofi Hope. Through their leadership, scholarship, and lived examples, both have helped bring the principles of Ubuntu to life, across borders, across generations, across communities. So as we begin, let's start where all meaningful conversations do, by learning more about who you are and how you've each come to this moment. So before I begin, I'd like to note that Dr. Mandela, you are, with affection and respect, referred to by your family's clan name, Madiba. So I'll refer to you as that this evening, and thank you for the invitation to do so. So, Madiba, your name carries and holds tremendous weight and meaning around the globe. Before we explore Ubuntu and its lessons for today's world, could you share how you understand your great-grandfather's legacy and how that legacy influences your work, your path, your purpose?
Thank you very much, Laura, for such an eloquent and wonderful introduction of our profiles. And to the audience, thank you for joining us in this conversation. It is a bit of a difficult moment as an aspiring diplomat, hopefully to join the South African Foreign Service Department. It's difficult to be in a position where I have to present myself and represent my country in front of my Excellency, our Consular General. So this is more of an interview of some sort.
I was going to say, no pressure.
But at least if I don't make it into foreign service, we know the reason why. Well, Laura, thank you for that question. I just recently finished a year and a quarter based in Iraq, in the northern region of Iraq, which is Kurdistan, where I was working on post-conflict reconstruction and development, as well as diplomacy. When I first landed in Iraq, I was greeted by the fellow Kurds, one of the most wonderful people that I've ever met in the Middle East. But a strange question that everyone kept asking me in that part of the world is, what the hell are you doing in this God-forsaken country? And for me, the question really puzzled me. But I came to understand that to them, or at least to many, there is this idea that all of us should be in pursuit or chasing what many call the American dream, or have an interest to immigrate to more in the Northern Hemisphere, in America, in Canada, and perhaps Europe. My interest was never in any of these countries. Well, I do like the conversation here, and I'm happy to be here. But for me, I responded to them by saying, when I studied history, I'm a student of political science and history. When I studied history, I remember the time where our nation's father, Mandela, was called by the Turkish government, and he was awarded in 1993, or at least he was to be awarded in 1993, what was then called the Atatürk Peace Prize. And Madiba rejected the Peace Prize, and when the media asked him, how dare you reject such a status and honor? And he said, if you want to understand the Turkish government, be a Kurd for a day. And to Madiba, it was an extension of solidarity to the Kurdish people as they were fighting for statehood, as they were fighting against the injustices that they were experiencing and perhaps still experiencing under the Iraqi government. And it is within this context that when we look at Madiba, we understand his legacy as one that is a towering figure of justice, freedom, peace, and reconciliation. So to me, it makes no sense to be in pursuit of interest in Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, but for me, it makes more sense to be where I am needed the most, where we can continue the work of advancing an agenda for peace, an agenda for justice and freedom, to be among people who need us the most. And this comes from an understanding that we owe our freedom to the solidarity of the international community. During our darkest of times, they stood with us. During the moment where our leaders, our forefathers and mothers were persecuted under the injustices of colonialism and apartheid, it was the people in Iraq, the Kurdish people, who were fighting for their own liberation, who understood us, who would welcome us. It was those who were still subjected under the injustices of the different forms of oppression who understood our struggle and who were open enough to accept us as the people and in fact give support as we're advancing an agenda for our own freedoms and for our own democracy. It is within this context, therefore, that when we look at Mandela's legacy as a towering figure of justice, we should not romanticize it. We should then go to where there is injustice and fight for justice. It is within this context that Madiba argues when we eventually, after years of relentless struggle against the injustices of apartheid and colonialism, he argues that our freedom is incomplete until the freedom of all the oppressed groups in the world, in particular the Palestinians. So it is within this context then, when I understand Madiba's legacy, I understand it as a clarion call for the struggle to continue. For as much as we are free, our brothers in Sudan are not free. Our brothers in Palestine are not free. Our brothers and sisters in the northern region of Iraq are not free. Our brothers and sisters in Ukraine are not free. So it is within this context that as this generation, at least as this generation, we understand Madiba and his legacy as a clarion call to say continue to advance an agenda for human rights where there is human rights violation. Continue to advance an agenda for justice where there is injustice. Even when it is not popular, and I've noticed this traveling across Europe and maybe not North America, and it was the case in the UK. It is unpopular to call out an injustice when you see it. When we speak to them, we say, in fact, this whole idea of what is currently happening in the Middle East, particularly the the Israel apartheid, which is exercised and deployed against the people of Palestine. We should call it what it is. It is an apartheid. And we say to them, we will be as the people, as South Africans. And this is what Mandela told us. When we see apartheid raises its ugly head, we should do anything and everything within our powers to reject it. And it is for this reason that when we speak of Mandela's legacy, we should not speak it in a fashion that seeks to romanticize it. It's not what it is. When there is an injustice, we must confront it. And even if it means that us as a country, as South Africa, we are left with the responsibility to mobilize and galvanize global solidarity against different forms of injustice, we will do it. And the reason why we should do it and the reason why we will do it, it's because all of you, as members of the human race, afforded us an opportunity to enjoy the freedoms that we're enjoying today. It was because of your international solidarity with us that enabled us to achieve our own freedom. And when the world is crazy, when the world is polarized, we would remind them of the importance of reconciliation. We would remind them of an importance of justice, and would remind them of an importance of freedom. And when we see injustice, we would remind them that do not forget that not so long ago, many of you thought that it was impossible for South Africa to emerge out of the ashes and the violence of apartheid. But because of your humanity, you have afforded us that opportunity. So therefore, we will stand as the youngest child within humanity, as one that reminds you of who you are when you are in your best, of you and who you are when you come together. For you came together, and that togetherness, and that unity, and that solidarity enabled us an opportunity to enjoy peace, freedom. It opened the prison doors for our heroes and heroines who were arrested for fighting for the simple, fundamental, basic principles of justice, freedom, and equality for all. And we stand as that reminder to the global community that if you can do for us, you can do it for those who are still suffering. And if you forget, we will remind you of who you are when you are in your best. And that is how we should understand Mandela's legacy.
Wow. Words in due season. Thank you for that. I don't know, I hope you brought your pajamas. Because we're on question 1, and I have so many, I could just camp on that, but I do want to move to you, Kofi, because your journey has been remarkable. From community activism to scholarship to global thought leadership. You've dedicated your life to equity, belonging, and empowering young people. What experiences led you to that focus?
Well, thank you for the question, Laura. And good evening, everyone. Madiba, what an honor and pleasure to share the stage with you, and as a scholar of Southern Africa and the Southern African Liberation Movement, what a dream to be here at this stage and in this platform. You know, when you were speaking in a very different context, but something it reminded me of, which I think is going to be a theme throughout our dialogue, when you spoke about people asking to you, you know, why didn't you move to the West? Or why didn't you use this platform to forage yourself? You know, a smile came to my face because it reminded me, coming back to Canada, you know, finishing a Rhodes Scholarship, getting a PhD, and people would, in a very different context, but similarly, and to a phenomenon that I think stands in real opposition to the values of Ubuntu, but people would come to me and say, Kofi, why are you going back to work in Jane and Finch? Why are you in a community health center? Why you know, and I remember one time an entrepreneur, a CEO, reached out to me and sat me down like an intervention. And it was kind of like, well, what are you doing here? Like, you could be at Boston Consulting Group, you could be here. Like, what are you doing here? And to me, my background, my upbringing, my faith, all the things that shaped me were a tradition that spoke about the idea of servant leadership, that spoke about the idea of to whom much is given, much is asked in return, and speaking about what a good life and a fulfilling and meaningful life being, one that you, to the best of your abilities, use the gifts and opportunities you are given to open doors for others. And I have to, really give thanks to my family for giving that. Both sides. I'm lucky enough to have had a Canadian and an Antiguan family, so having been raised in both cultures to a degree, to an extent. My family from the Caribbean, it was a kind of generations of a tradition of service through kind of teachers and education, involvement in the trade unionist movement. My grandfather and my great uncle were very involved in that transition over from Antigua, going from British rule to independence. Actually, proud to say the national motto of Antigua and Barbuda, my grandfather wrote, each endeavoring, all achieving.
Wow.
And so that was something that was there. And on the Canadian side as well, both my Canadian grandparents were lifelong members of the NDP, were kind of activists in that context, and so grew up at Christmas dinners, at Thanksgiving tables, where conversations about racial justice, about poverty, about the importance of being part of your community and giving back was just a regular thing that was, you'd sit there and listen to people discussing and talk about and see who the grandparents had brought a guest in from Iran or from Taiwan or different places and invited them to be with us. And so that was something that was just part of family tradition, I guess, passed on to me, that I had that privilege. And then I think giving back, what really shaped it, when I was 15 years old, first job I had, was at the church that my family was a part of in West End of Mississauga, right on the border of Oakville. Place that was supposed to be on paper, a fully kind of middle class to upper middle class neighborhood, but there was a collection of buildings that were kind of government housing, rent-geared income, and the young people, predominantly black and brown, living in those buildings, grew up in a community that there wasn't a place for them, right? There, it was a 30-minute walk, if not 45-minute walk to the nearest community center, and the assumption was everyone was driving cars, that everyone could, send their kids to horseback riding camp or swimming lessons or whatever it was. And that church opened a program because young people were literally being chased by police off of the school grounds for shooting a basketball, were being harassed by private security with dogs when they would hang in front of the corner store. And we opened a program there called Oasis. And that was my first job, was running youth programming in the community. And when I was 18 years old, had the privilege where they tapped me on the shoulder and said, Kofi, the person who's run this program has left. They were, in their 30s, which seemed so old at the time. And they said, we'd like you to run the program. And stepped into that. It was a challenge, managing budgets, we had an after-school program, we had a breakfast club, but did that over the summers. And over the years of working in that program and trying to understand what it meant to be in solidarity, what it meant to do to build connection across class, across culture. And then I went to the University of Toronto. And at that point, unfortunately, it had already reached the point where some of those young people I'd worked with and many of my peers, guys I went to high school with, spent lots of time hanging with, so many of them, and especially those who looked like me or who looked darker than me, fell into lifestyles around violence, crime, selling drugs. I remember getting a call from my sister about a young man I'd worked with a couple summers ago, had just been arrested on murder charges, was first year at U of T, one of my best friends, in front of that same corner store, nearly died from a kind of incident of violence. And it was 2004, 2005, for folks remember, in this city, called the Summer of the Gun, or the Year of the Gun. And every day you're opening the newspaper and seeing young black men and women falling victims to violence, but also a discourse back then that made it seem like black youth were the enemy, were some foreign species that had invaded the city and brought defective cultures from Jamaica or Somalia, and that went against kind of Canadian values. Even most of them were born and raised here, but had done something so terribly wrong by their existence, and it was kind of a stain and a national embarrassment that this was happening. And I had the privilege at the time of being the president of the Black Students Association at the University of Toronto, and gathered folks up, and we all kind of said, listen, black youth are not the problem in this city, and we're actually the solution, because It's 1%, 0.1% of our peers who are involved in this lifestyle, but if we need to show them a different path, we need to give them new realities, change what's happening, it's other Black youth who have the ability best suited to do that. It's not the police, it's not the Children's Welfare Association, it's not these areas, it's actually young people stepping up who can make a change. And we made our voices heard. We knocked on every door that would listen to us. It ended up bringing us to, the mayor's office, to Queen's Park, to eventually being part of a group with, leaders like Dudley Laws who passed. We all went up to Ottawa together and were able to bring that message directly to Prime Minister Paul Martin. And those experiences, that saying, hey, look what can happen when 10 of us here on campus in a room can organize, can stay up every night late planning, strategizing, and suddenly now we're having impact on a national conversation. We're actually making change for our community, and we're actually seeing things move forward in a positive way. That was what kind of locked me in for the path to say, this is the work I want to do and dedicate my life to. But I will add, the piece that then changed it to put it to an even deeper level was finishing my degree and going to start working in the Jane Finch community, amazing part of the city, one of the most diverse, dynamic places, but as many folks who are from Toronto know, one of the most stigmatized parts of the city as well. And showing up, walking in, I'm the guy who went and talked to the Prime Minister and on the news all the time talking about these issues and going in that room with young men there who are like, who is this nerd? What are you doing here? Why should we respect you? And realizing it was just like in any other youth work. Didn't matter what credentials you brought, what your past was. It was, do you show up every week? Do you follow up to the things that you promise? Yes. Do you support in the way they are? Are you willing to walk with folks, not from up here, but as equals? And that had me thinking deeply about my own privilege, about all the things that allowed me to get to the place I was. It made me think about the other young people I organized with. And was like, oh yeah, at the time we just thought we'd go and speak for these issues, but actually, we were Black students at the most prestigious university in Canada. We actually had a lot of privilege that we were speaking from.
Yes.
We were utilizing that. And that made me really deeply think about this idea of solidarity. What does it mean for people who have different positional power, whether it's from the global north, working with those in the global south, whether it's those in their own city, coming from more privileged backgrounds, working with those in working class or lower income communities? How do we come together in that spirit of Ubuntu to make change, but in a way that's ethical and proper? And I took those questions to my PhD, I took them to my master's work, I took them to Southern Africa and to my studies of the anti-apartheid movement. And that has shaped everything forward, not just that want to give back, but to do it in a way that is ethical, that thinks about power, that thinks about solidarity, and thinks about how you live it out day to day in everything you do.
Wow. So, what stands out and cuts across what you both shared is that while in different ways, both of your stories really get to the essence of and reflect what Ubuntu is in action. The idea that we become ourselves through one another. Which brings us perfectly to where I want to go next. I want to explore the origins of Ubuntu itself and what it can mean as a framework for equity and belonging in today's world. So, Madiba, I want to go to you next. You've spoken about how Ubuntu is not only a cultural value, but a deeper worldview, a constitutional and political philosophy embedded in South Africa's foreign policy and moral compass. Where does Ubuntu come from? I mean, we heard some of it today from Archbishop Desmond Tutu and also from the Consul General, but I do want to hear kind of your perspectives on where Ubuntu comes from and how did it become woven into South Africa's reconciliation, national identity, and moral direction.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that question. Maybe I'll begin to respond to it in this fashion. South Africa is a multifaceted, multicultural, and a multiracial country that has adopted the concept of Ubuntu as a means by which we define ourselves as the people and how we relate to others as well. Ubuntu as an African philosophy means humanity. The idea that we affirm our humanity through affirming the humanity of others. Simple stated, I am because you are. It is an idea from a South African point of view. It is within this context that South Africa, because of its own past, dealing with the injustices and the crimes of colonialism and apartheid, which represented dehumanization of the indigenous people, land dispossession, human rights violation, and many other crimes that I can continue to list before you. But it is within this context that South Africa decided that our foreign policy will be defined by the basic tenets of Ubuntu, and thus the foreign policy of Ubuntu, which means that the project of restoring dignity back to our people because of the injustices of colonialism and apartheid, the intention to restore and making sure that our people who have been deprived the privilege of enjoying the fundamental principles of life, which is human rights, we should restore that privilege back to our people. And therefore, we should also make sure that justice, peace, and reconciliation is also an anchor of what South Africa is as a country. And it is within that context that our foreign policy posture is anchored on the philosophy of Ubuntu. We do that because we understand that who we are as the people, we enjoy these freedoms and these liberties because of men and women, ordinary men and women, who marched in the streets of the United States, in the streets of Canada, who marched across Europe, who marched across Africa, in solidarity to the people of South Africa. And to us, that is what Ubuntu is. It is within this context that we say as a country, when we go out, our duty should be to bring justice where there is no justice, for it was done to us. When we go out as a country, we should not seek to advance confrontation and conflict. We should seek to bring about peace and reconciliation, and that is Ubuntu. It is within this context that when we come, for instance, I'm giving you now an example. When we come to a country like Canada, one of the fundamental questions that we ask the government of Canada is that we will not only help you to reconcile or with reconciliation, but we are going to also ask the critical questions about the indigenous communities here in Canada. I was speaking in a particular topic elsewhere within Canada, and I argued that one of the things that are not as well pronounced about the Canadian people is that as much as they played a fundamental and a key role in mobilizing within Commonwealth for the isolation of the apartheid South Africa, in defense of the idea of freedom and justice, But in the main, there is historical evidence to the fact that the 1876 Indian Act, which played a fundamental role and a central role in the dehumanization of the indigenous communities here, ended up years later becoming a blueprint by which the South African people would be oppressed, marginalized, suppressed, and even violated. So when we do that, we therefore look at the people that were oppressed and violated. And my work through the past 10 years since I started traveling across Canada, working with indigenous communities, I came to the conclusion that in fact, it is perhaps correct to argue that the apartheid system was fashioned at the backdrop of the Indian Act, because when I go to indigenous communities, I see the legacy of the residential school systems, which are identical to the legacy of Bantu education system in South Africa. And the problems that continue to embattle the indigenous communities, be it you go to indigenous schooling systems where there's a lack of water, there's lack of access to basic services such as water, libraries. The school system itself is incapacitated. It is identical to the realities of my people back home in South Africa to this day. It is within this context then we say, when we come here in Canada, we therefore identify with the indigenous people. It is within this reason that even Mandela, our nation's father, when he came to Canada in the late 90s, he made it a statement that he should meet with the indigenous people. For our struggles are interrelated. And the crimes that they suffered are the same crimes that we suffered. And to us, that is Ubuntu. That even though we relate with Canada in a manner that is defined by cooperation and solidarity, we should ask those critical questions about the problems that confront those that we identified with, which is the indigenous communities. So it is within this context that you should therefore understand what Ubuntu is. It's not about being romantic about how life and politics is. It is about really having a genuine intention to connect, to collaborate, but connection at times requires us to be authentic and to be critical of one another. That is how we build one another. It is therefore, as a foreign policy posture and as a way of life, it is an African philosophy that requires each and every one of us to understand that no man lives as an island. Where man is oppressed, where a woman is violated, we should all be concerned. Our great leader, Desmond Tutu, further argues elsewhere that neutrality in times of injustice is nothing but siding with the oppressor. And we should never do that. We should always carry Ubuntu as a way of life, which requires us to engage even in the most difficult of questions. We should confront them. That is how we begin to build bridges within society. We have to be honest with one another. That is how we begin to build bridges. But at the core of Ubuntu is an idea that we should be in pursuit of solidarity, in pursuit of oneness, and an understanding that as members of the human family, all we have is ourselves. We have no one else but ourselves. But when one of ours commits crimes and injustices against your neighbor, we should all stand in solidarity to reprimand, to question, and to correct those among us who pursue ideas that are contrary to the universal ideas of justice, peace, and security for all. That to us is Ubuntu.
Absolutely. And one thing that I think we need to acknowledge in the current climate that we find ourselves in is that even where you have those who have the genuine intent to pursue solidarity, to pursue freedom, to pursue justice, we're in an era where the resistance is louder, it's more organized, it's more combative, and it's more discouraging than in recent years. So this question's for you, Kofi. How do we fix it? No. How would you describe, because there's a very specific brand of resistance right now, so how would you describe what appears to be this new heightened type of resistance? And in the face of this resistance, how do you sustain hope and courage in your work?
Well, so the first part of the question, how do we describe what's happening? I think as a fellow political scientist, you know when you look at history that these things work in cycles, right? And I think one of the biggest illusions that many of us in the West bought into, and I remember being there in Oxford, 2008, when Barack Obama won, and I've never seen Americans cry like that before, and maybe not again, but it was a good thing. It was needed cries that, needed tears that dropped, but that feeling from everyone that, hey, we are on this historical up.
It's a new day.
And you remember, I'll try not to reference too much American politics, but it's hard these days. But you remember at the time, people were like, oh, we may never see a Republican president again. Look at the demographics, look at the values changing, these things, these isms, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, it's all on the way out. It's going to pass with the generation that will, pass on, and the new generations will have transcended this. And we had proof. And, it did feel good at that time. I remember that hopefulness, and, I was in grade 13, which for some of the people here we used to have in this province. I think I was the last year of grade 13. I was in grade 13 when, September 11th happened. First protest, the first political action I was a part of was a march against, the invasion of Iraq, right downtown. That was, so there was, for all of us who had come up, I'm a true kind of millennial, like came of age right at the millennium. First, there was this dark time of the war on terror, Bush, et cetera. And then there was this change with Obama, and there was this shift in things, and you felt like, okay, things are moving, and we're on this rocket ship. What we didn't recognize in so many ways is that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the arc of history stretches long, but it curves towards justice.
Yes.
But that's not simply through some organic force. That's not simply through divine forces that we sit aside and let it happen. That curvature towards justice comes from the actions that Madiba spoke about, from everyday people stepping up, pushing for it, challenging injustice, calling it out. And I think what we've seen is that to just think, hey, we've transcended this, everything is good. No. Well, those of us who at least fall in that political persuasion, we're feeling good and reveling in all the changes happening, and real changes have happened.
Yes.
But at the same time, those who felt threatened by it, those who sat in opposition to it, those who felt otherwise, were organizing. We're preparing. We're finding places to gather on the internet together. We're exchanging ideas. And now we are in the counteraction, right? We are in the pushback. The scary part about it is this pushback against democratic values, this pushback against human rights, this pushback against equity, wokeism, which is the only time I'll say it on this stage because it is just an appropriation and weaponizing of black language and culture when people use that term, but it's out there, so I'll name it for a moment. All of that pushback that's happening right now is the response to the progress that's been made. And people trying to re-entrench and bring us back, and it's happening globally. And it's incredibly scary. Like, we think about anti-apartheid, right? Of all the nations, Canada was great, but of all the nations, at least for me studying it, and maybe you have a different take, but in the West, that stood with the South African people from the start, it was the Nordic countries. It was, Sweden being one of them from the very start, throughout, they stood up for it. Then you see, in the last 10 years, Sweden, a place that's led around progressive causes, now has a far-right party with significant support in parliament, with significant momentum. I don't think they're going to take over government, but on the way there, and you think, what? How is it that these beacons of these ideals of human rights and justice are now falling back to these ideas of straight-up fascism and authoritarianism that are happening all over the world? Well, friends, the reality is, as I said, we do not get just societies, we do not live out Ubuntu unless we fight for it. And every generation has this struggle with those darker sides of human nature, with those darker sides of human society, and I don't think it would be any more clear than if you look at the news today, what the struggles are of our time. So to that question, I don't know how we solve it, but if we're thinking about what does it mean to see these, or what your question was, how do you find hope in these times? How do we look at it? Some people may say, well, turn your phone off. Might be part of it.
That's a start.
But I will share, at least for me, and I'm going to read a quote, because this is something I had on the wall in my office. It was a tiny little office in the Black Creek Community Health Center when I founded the C Center for Young Black Professionals, which, shout out C, is now the largest charity in Canada serving Black youth. I was very proud of founding it and handing it over, and I've watched it soar. But in those first days when it was me, myself, and a pen and pad of paper, I put this quote on the wall. I'll read it out. It's from the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And
Love it.
And there were some difficult days, right? Building, for those who've been in the nonprofit sector, building a new charity, building a new group, especially working with youth who are highly marginalized, who are in conflict with the law, who were precariously housed, et cetera, was not easy. Remember one day pulling into Yorkgate Mall in Jane and Finch, things were going wrong in the organization, youth had been arrested, youth were in crisis, it was feeling pretty tough, and I remember about to get out of the car, I look over, and we're there in Jane Finch, and I saw a seagull eating a pigeon. And the seagull kind of looked up at me like, what? And I was like, I'm turning this car around, I'm done, I'm out. But I had to take a deep breath, and because you're thinking, oh, there's only places I could be, there's so many other things I could do, and say, no, I am here for those young people we've lost.
Yeah.
I am here for those folks who believed in investing in Black youth, who put forward the money to make this happen. I had inherited that program after it had failed 3 times to get off the ground. I knew if it's not happening this time, that money is going back. And I said, I'm getting my butt out of the seat, pull up my big boy pants, get into the office, and keep going. And of course, I had those words on the wall. And what I love about those pieces, and I think the connection to Ubuntu, is on your own as an individual trying to make a change in the world, it is daunting. It is overwhelming. It can be quite hopeless. But for me, what brings that inspiration, I hope for many people, is realizing you are part of something greater than yourself. Whether you want to take that in a spiritual sense or fully secular. The idea that you are part of a movement that our ancestors before started, that those ahead of us, my daughter's there in the front row, her and her generation will pick up the torch and move it forward. And it is not about conquering these issues. It would be great. I'd love to say we could eliminate poverty, we could eliminate hate, we could get rid of the wealth inequality between the North and South. We may not see that in our lifetimes, but that is not the call to us. It's to move things forward as best we can, to face these issues with integrity and with love, and to know that it is not on us ultimately to solve them, and to know the solidarity we have with other people in the struggle. And maybe that's the last reflection I'll give on this. It's something I talk about in my TED Talk. But when I did my research into the anti-apartheid movement in Canada and the legacy of it, there was a really inspiring man I met. His name was Jim Kirkwood. He was about 83 years old when I met him. You know, literally was kind of curved over with a walker, but would still get on his bike every morning to go to a church basement on Bloor Street to help run a website, Africa Files, that would have different political articles for folks here around what was happening in the African continent. He went in the 60s as a missionary to Southern Africa, the idea he was going to change people and evangelize, and he became evangelized himself to the cause of Southern African liberation, and came here and spent 40 years as a stalwart in that movement. I remember I interviewed him deeply for the thesis, and he told me one time, he said, Kofi, you know what? In the late 60s, if you were in Toronto saying, I support the African National Congress, he's like, that meant you were saying, I support a black, atheist, Marxist, terrorist organization. He was like, it was not mainstream. It was almost like if someone was to say, you know, I support Afghan liberation. I don't support the Taliban, but I support this aligned armed group that struggled there. Like, it would get you canceled before canceled was a thing. It would get you blacklisted. It could really ruin your career prospects. And he said, those were dark days. We were 20 years out from when Desmond Tutu came and addressed folks in the early 80s at Queen's Park. We were 20 years out from when free Nelson Mandela was a mainstream thing. Yeah. He said, during those dark days when this struggle was so fringe, when people looked at us like absolute weirdos, yeah. He said, the one thing I learned, Kofi, was that hope lives in community.
Yes, it does.
And he's like, we found 5, 6, 7, 8 people who shared our views, and we held each other tight, and we supported each other, and we showed up for each other, and we marched together, and if one of us got arrested or got blacklisted, we were there. And he's like, that's where hope is not something you just falls from the sky. You feel it through that experience of Ubuntu, yes. Through comradeship, through working together, through struggle together. And so I say to anyone who is feeling daunted right now, which many of us are, the answer is not to go deeper down that doom-scrolling rabbit hole, but is to reach out to folks in our own context, in our own neighborhood, in our own street, and do something, and organize, and push a change forward, even if it seems so insignificant, even if it's about changing something in your park, or your school, or helping the unhoused who have an encampment, you know, in your local neighborhood. That is how we start pushing that arc of history back towards justice through everyday people, not waiting for the professionals or anyone else to save us, through everyday people getting involved in changing at the local or at the global, at whatever context you feel moved, but standing up together. And that's how you feel that hope. When you see what you can do, as I said, as a student, when I saw, hey, 10 of us, if we're working really hard and we care really deeply, we can actually shift an issue. And I think so many people today have not felt that. So many young people, especially going through COVID, when there was university and junior high, didn't have the chance to be part of clubs or groups. It's about how do we come together, begin to fight that good fight, and that's where we'll find our hope, that's where we'll find our courage. And it's through that togetherness of Ubuntu that we can actually feel that change happening and be part of making it.
Absolutely love that. Love that. And there's so much to unpack there. Unfortunately, we don't have the time, but I do want to harken back to the quote from the Talmud that you shared. Love that you have that as a beacon, because it reminds us that perseverance, endurance, resilience, they're not solo acts, right? It's a collective stance, which falls right in line with Ubuntu. So, wanted to give an opportunity for those of you in the audience, if you have any questions for Dr. Hope, Dr. Mandela, please, now's your opportunity to bring them forward. We have a question here.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the presentations. I have one question. I know that the audience is comprised a lot of students. I know my TMU students are right here. I'm the chancellor of the Toronto Metropolitan University. And for the last couple of years, we've had a lot of struggles for students engaging. What do you say to students about engagement when there is so much for them to lose? When there is so much fear, when the backlash doesn't stop? Particularly
Madiba?
Thank you very much, Honorable Chancellor. When I first came to university, I was privileged to be welcomed by a cohort of young activists, comrades, who took me first through a process of political education. For them, they understood that the space that we're coming into, and this is really the nature of the state of higher education, it has a tendency to alienate you from your identity, your people, strip you of the ability to even understand your culture and your lineage. And they have observed this when they first encountered institutions of higher learning, that the current education system is not designed to cater to the needs of the marginalized and the oppressed people. It is a space for the more privileged class within our society. So the political education classes that they took us through was to prepare us that we should not assimilate into the machinery that is called the higher education sector. One way in which I will point that is, part of that, they said we need to decolonize the education system. And then we asked, what do you mean by decolonizing the education system? They said, if you go to the libraries as they exist in this current state, they are designed to advance epistemic violence, which means that much of what is within those libraries is not the true representation and the reflection of what society is. A primary example would be an indigenous student would go through an education system, the 4 years of education system in Canada, and they've never even once been afforded an opportunity to have a professor that speaks like them, that looks like them, that have a lived experience like them. So when you then engage with that education system, then you have to be cognizant of these conflicting identities. And when you go through political education, it gives you, it empowers you to be able to make sure that as you enter, and this is really what we were taught, as you enter the door, make sure that you don't close it behind you, so that the next person who is underprivileged as you can be afforded the same opportunity to come through. And when they come through, we take them through the process of political education. And it is that political education that enables us to understand that these spaces were never designed for us. They were designed for a particular class within society. And if we are to transform them from within, we need to understand who we are and understand our place and our responsibility within those institutions. And when you understand that, you know that the limited freedoms that you have and that you enjoy came as a result of sacrifice. It came as a result of resilience of those who were oppressed, marginalized, and not even afforded an opportunity to study in the very same universities. So when we go in carrying the dreams of those who have opened the doors for us, of those who have sacrificed so that we can get that education. So when you confront the beast that exists as the higher education sector, which is colonial in its character, you confront it understanding that those that came before you made a lot of sacrifices for you to come in. So you cannot cower in the face of injustice and oppression and crimes. You should confront them as well. That is how you slowly transform those structures. So through that political education and the solidarity that you then galvanize with your fellow peers, other students coming from poor backgrounds, coming from privileged backgrounds, you are able to have a consensus on what is it that you want as this generation. Do you want to continue to reinforce the existing norms and structures which marginalize the rest and give privilege to the few? Or should we, as this generation, take a stand to say, standing shoulder to shoulder, we will fight until the bitter end, for we come from those who have fought relentlessly and they emerged victoriously. So when you then go through those systems of political education, I was in a student formation called South African Student Association, SASCO as we call it. It is that education of being a revolutionary that enables to understand that when we go in, we have to fight for those that are left behind so that no one is left behind. And that gives you the resilience that you need to survive within that system. And the reality is, and I would perhaps, I'm convinced that you even understand as the honorable leader and the chancellor, that the institutions as it stands needs to be transformed. And that transformation will come about as a result of constant revolt, which should come from the student body itself. And you should be receptive of the revolt from the students, because theirs is merely directed towards the transformation or the need to transform the structure itself. That is how you then enable and cultivate the grounds that will therefore usher to equity, transformation, and a form of reconciliation. That is how I would respond to that question. Political education.
Do we have another question? We have a number of questions. Right over here.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I was actually visiting South Africa during apartheid, so for me this is a blessing. Thank you for this discussion. I'm a community builder and work with a lot of organizations. My question is, if more leaders embraced the guiding principles of Ubuntu, what practical shifts would we be able to see in government and organizational decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think what we're seeing right now in politics, for certain, at every level of government, but even in organizations everywhere, is a move towards concentration of powers at the executive level, at the C-suite level, and this constant refrain in our very hyper-individualistic society, which we didn't get a chance to talk about, the contrast of where our society is versus where Ubuntu calls us, but that is constantly about platforming this illusion of a leader as, usually a strong man on a horse pushing forward. And we have these discourses all the time, and we're seeing it in the concentration. So, you hear about, when it comes to business, people always talk about, the remarkable journey of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or these leaders, right? And we give a specific narrative which says leadership is about being tough, it's about not being very nice, it's about this brilliant rogue outsider who just pushes their way forward, which totally discredits with, and any of those folks, the thousands of people who worked with them to help them to get there, the teams that were behind them, the fact many of them took research that came from publicly funded universities, which we all paid for, and then capitalized it for private gain. But also that leadership does not need to look like this. So to your question, and this is actually my business partner, Zara, talks a lot about this, about different leadership styles. And I think in the 21st century, and if we bring in Ubuntu, we're looking at a type of leadership that leads with humility. What does that mean? That leads with inquiry, right? That has this idea of integrative thinking. That's not, I simply am the rogue genius and I know exactly what our organization should do and where we go. It's that inquiring mind that says, I have an idea, Laura, you have an idea. There's pretty good chance if the two of our ideas combine, we can actually achieve something better and an even better perspective that fills in my blind spots and your blind spots and moves us closer to the truth than if we simply engage in debate club and get online, whether it's here online or in person, just one-upping each other and who's got the better argument. I'm not even really listening to what you're saying because I'm thinking about what my retort is. That kind of leadership we've all been exposed to, and it's part of how we got into the condition we're at in the West. I think we need to move towards paradigms, and here's where we can learn from other parts of the world. I had that experience working with indigenous folks. I was at Walpole Island once when I was in my 20s, invited to a meeting of elders sitting around the table. And I remember during the meeting, people were saying, what do we do for the youth around this? And everyone sitting at the table said, And someone said, well, how do we invest? We're going to have this event coming up. What should we do there? And everyone said, And this woman, Lorna Powis from Wasauksing First Nation, who I was working with, a mentor to me, afterwards, she's like, what did you think of the meeting? I said, that was awful. And she's like, what do you mean? I'm like, everyone asked questions and no one responded. And she said, Kofi, that's your culture. In your culture, it's about speaking whenever someone says anything to try to show how smart you are. In my culture, if you do not know the answer, the right response is to say, It's to refrain from jumping in there. It's a different way to do it. I go to Oxford to African Studies. I'm there, we're talking about African politics, neo-patrimonialism in the classroom. Why is it all the kids from Canada, from America, and Britain are always jumping to say African countries should do this, should this happen? All the African students were sitting there. The ones with lived experience in the continent, understanding the context, I came to realize, oh yeah, this is the tradition that I've been trained in, that leadership means you always have the answer. You're on that horse, you say, go in this direction. You're never reconsidering things, versus leaders who lead with humility. When we had that moment when the George Floyd time, where I got to be called in and work with leaders of billion-dollar companies in Canada, the best leaders were the ones who said, Kofi, we don't know what to do with this. Yeah. It's outside of our experience. This equity thing, we don't, and we would tell, and they'd say, what would we do? And we'd say, well, the thing you don't do is get in front of an all-staff town hall and say you have all the answers. The thing you do is you show some humility. You admit these are my blind spots, and you ask your organization to come with you and help you craft solutions. And those were the ones who actually showed that kind of servant leadership, that inquiry, that curiosity, who actually were able to move forward at the times. And it was the leadership teams that just went into command and control, and we're gonna do this, do that, we're gonna create an equity VP, promote this black woman here, oh great, solved. Who ended up just in the same problem a year later. So to me, Ubuntu means more collective leadership, participatory leadership, but also that humility and inquiry and curiosity in leadership. The things that we may not see in Time magazine or held up, but the things that I think all of us who've been in successful organizations know that real leadership is truly about.
Excellent, excellent. So I did see a number of hands up, and unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're not going to be able to take other questions, but remember, this is the first in a series. So there's a lot more where this has come from. But I am going to take a moderator's liberty. And I have a final question for you both. We started tonight's conversation talking about legacies, those we inherit, those we create. And I'm going to also put you to a challenge, because I'm going to ask that your responses be 30 seconds or less. So here's the question for you, the closing question. When you think about your legacy, your own legacy, what do you hope it will be? Put another way, what do you want future generations to say that you stood for? Madiba?
That's a very difficult question, especially in 30 seconds. In my culture, they say Madibomde, that means the tall one. So hence, it's difficult to make summaries at times. Yeah. But what should I be remembered for? The legacy that I leave behind. I want my children to be able to say tomorrow that our father came. He built upon the foundation laid by his forefathers, the foundation of justice, peace, freedom, and democracy. And what he did with that foundation was to build a home that was able to withstand all the storms that confronted it. Be it the storms that we see confronting humanity today. We should also remember, as much as we are weathering the storms, our foundation is solid. It is anchored in the principles that we all hold dear. And for that house to stand, we need to defend that foundation and build upon it. And my children should be able to say tomorrow, just like your great-grandfather, your mother, ordinary men and women fought for you to enjoy these freedoms that you enjoyed in your lifetime. You were able to build upon them so that your generation and the generations yet to come are afforded those very same principles and ideals and even more. That is what I hope for. And that is a clarion call to my fellow compatriots and young leaders here, that we have a collective responsibility to then build upon this foundation. We should not allow it to fall apart. Ours is to take what is given to us and build upon it, so that when they ask us 50 years to come, we can be able to point to them that we have built this strong castle upon the foundation that was laid by our forefathers and foremothers who have made a lot of sacrifice for such ideals.
Beautiful, beautiful. Kofi, before I turn to you, I have to make mention of the fact that you had said your daughter's here, and she's here in the front row. And when I said to her in greeting her, "So great you're here," she said, "I'm here because I'm proud of my dad." So your legacy's on track. But same question to you. What do you want your legacy to be?
Yeah, my father was born in Toronto, grew up in Stouffville. And in Stouffville, there is a family plot in the cemetery, actually. My grandfather is buried there. My grandmother, my mother is buried there. And on my grandfather's tomb, it says, "A man of honor, integrity, and compassion." And if I go out, if that's what they could put on my headstone, I'm doing pretty well. Along with that, of course, a legacy of speaking up to justice, of using the gifts I had to open doors for others. But I'm glad you mentioned my daughter, because maybe one of the things personally for me that's so important is, and being someone who's been on, for a lot of my life on a track for leadership, and have had the privilege to share stages and workplaces with great leaders, and to look to great leaders from the past. The one thing that I've always wanted to make part of my legacy is someone who could be a great leader in community and also be one in their own home, in their own household.
Yes, yes.
Because unfortunately, we have a legacy of so many, I'll call it out, of so many men who are great leaders in public, not great husbands, not great fathers, not great people to those closest to them in their most intimate of relationships. And one thing I've strived for and continue to strive for every day, and including if it means sacrifices in career opportunities or other places to have larger platforms, is saying, being someone who is there for my family, whenever I can, is at the dinner together with everyone, who is opening up doors for my daughter, for my son, spending that time, that is equally important to anything achieved in the world. And I think we are in an age where we desperately need moral consistency in folks, right? We've had enough of leaders who speak platitudes, and then when things come out and things are revealed, you see it was like night and day, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So at least for me, that legacy to be what you see is what you got. I wore my heart in my sleeve, and the way I treated others is the way I treated those here. The way I did it in the light is the way I did it in the dark. And that for me is the basis of the leadership that I want to leave as a legacy to my kids.
You know, I've spent my time up here stifling amens. I'm going to say amen to that. So there's so much to take away from what we've heard from you, Dr. Mandela, and you, Dr. Hope, this evening, but one thing certainly rings clear. Ubuntu reminds us that no one stands alone. In a time where fear and division too often divide and actually define our headlines, this evening's dialogue calls us back to something truer, that our lives are deeply interwoven, that our collective strength lies in compassion, courage, and connection. So again, please join me in thanking Dr. Mandela and Dr. Hope